Anybody have any questions? Is it wrong that I have the urge to play Minecraft now? I don't think that's ever wrong. I think that's always an appropriate urge. I talked a bit about show don't tell. What do I think of other narrated games like Bastion? What does the narrator accomplish there? Oh God, that's so. I actually haven't played Bastion. I mean, I've played like a little bit of Bastion. I wasn't crazy about the gameplay. I like the narrator, and I really should play more of it in order just to, because it's an important sort of touchstone. And the way that it uses the narrator, from what I can tell, is very, very cool. Um, the narrator in that game, I think, is used in a world building way. I mean, that's a game that is quite literally about building a world, and the mechanics of it, or at least the style of it, is all built around this idea of creating the world as you go. The narrator in that case, I think, is part of this idea of establishing the world that you're in the same way that like a landscape appears around you. The narrator is creating narrative context around you. It's contextualizing the actions that you take and the places that you discover, which I think is like a really cool, interesting thing. Um, but I think the narrator in that game like is well, a narrator in any game is going to be a device, right? A narrator is a very deliberate sort of tool to put into a game, into any kind of story. Um, it's more common in movies, and so it can be used more thoughtlessly in movies. But in games, it's not that common, and so it is always going to be very deliberate when you see a narrator, and it can be used to different purpose. I'm struggling to think of a lot of games that I've played like a substantial amount of that use a narrator that I can sort of comment on what the narrator is used for. Like I think a Bard's Tale uses a narrator, but I really haven't played enough of that game to get a sense of why or what the narrator does in that game. Um, why don't more designers give the players more choices like they do in this game? It's extremely hard. I think I mean, it's two things. It's creatively difficult. Uh, Davey has expended an enormous amount of effort to think about all of the different things that a player could be doing at any particular moment, and crafting an experience pinpointed at each of those players. Um, that's a thing that when you are making a game that's 15 minutes long, you can do. And even then, it's difficult. And we can see, I mean, I say this game is 15 minutes long. Obviously, there's a lot more than 15 minutes worth of content in it. Every time we've made a different choice, we've opened up an entirely new content area that's, completely fresh. But we still have to consider this as like a 15-minute game because that's how long a playthrough experience is. If you're creating now a 3-hour game or an 8-hour game or a 20-hour game or a 60-hour game, the amount of content that you have to create something as dense as the Stanley Parable is exponential, right? It's not just gonna like linearly increase that this is whatever 3 hours of content packed into a 15-minute game, and so a 15-hour game is going to be I can't do math, like a linear increase in the amount of content that you squeeze into it. It's exponential because every choice that you make early in the game is going to lead you to a different set of choices late in the game, and if it doesn't, then it doesn't feel as narratively dense. It's not as rich an interactive experience, and that's what games typically do. They try to find a balance between the amount of choice that you have the amount of choice that you feel like you have, and the amount of content that is actually produced, because content is extremely expensive to produce. And so the size of a game and the cost of a game goes up dramatically when you try to make it narratively dense like this. And the only reason that Davey and his team were able to do it is because the game is so short, and they put an enormous amount of effort into it. But I think it's mostly a practical reason. I don't think it's game designers, don't care about interactivity. Game designers absolutely care about interactivity. That's sort of what they're there for. That's what this medium offers. But in the real world, there are limitations on what you can do. I'm in the process of working on a JRPG with an excruciatingly linear story. Your commentary on this game have given me incredible things to think about. Do you have any thoughts on narratives in the JRPG genre? In the last Q&A, I think I talked about how I don't feel like I have enough exposure to what I would call JRPG games to be able to make comments on the entire genre. I have only played a few of them, and the ones that I have really played, I mentioned Persona 4, like that's the big one. That's the big one that I played. I don't know if it's typical, but I think it actually does a really good job of balancing that at least perceived player agency. It's got a very sort of linear path from beginning to end, with lots of interesting choices that all sort of circle around that linear path, that have to do with the relationships that you develop with other characters. So the core story doesn't really change no matter what you do, with some exceptions. But your experience of the story changes dramatically depending on who your friends are and who your sort of not friends are, and if you choose to pursue a romantic relationship with someone and who that is, and all of that sort of changes your experience of the game in a dramatic way. And that's something that I appreciate enormously. That's an approach to agency and interactivity that I really like, where you sort of say the game itself is going to have a plot, and the plot is going to be interesting, but the plot is going to be limited in how much it branches. It's going to be mostly linear, and maybe it's not entirely linear, but it's going to be mostly linear, especially considering how much content there is. But there are other things that you can do that cause you to experience that plot differently. And frequently that is around the relationships that you develop with side characters. And so I love, for example, BioWare games, which, like Persona 4, they have a component where you are following along with a story, but they also have a component where you have a cast of secondary characters that you have various relationships with, and you can sort of you can change what those relationships are, and depending on what you do with each of those characters, you're gonna have a different sort of story experience, because even though the big plot is the same for everybody, the big plot is almost backdrop to the things that you are doing moment to moment. And the things that you're doing moment to moment, while they don't have like big narrative branches associated with them, there are different options that sort of crop up. In BioWare games, it's in like dialogue options that you have, or in banter that you hear between characters, and that kind of thing. And that's extremely rewarding, and that feels like you're changing your experience based on the choices that you made. Nobody lives long enough to really know JRPGs. Yeah, I think that's probably true. Fallout 2 is another example of a linear game with varying content. Yes, the Bethesda games also do this very well, and they do it in a different way than BioWare tends to do it, but it's not dramatically different. They use sort of a different set of tools to employ a lot of similar strategies. And especially, I would argue that with Inquisition, BioWare is sort of blurring the line between what we think of as a BioWare game and as a Bethesda game. Banner Saga was a good example of a fairly linear game that felt like your choices really mattered. I also haven't really played Banner Saga. I just tried out the combat. I haven't had time to like actually play it. Popo out to get me. Yes, I live in Los Angeles and I live near a freeway, and so there is definitely an occasional police presence that I hear through my window. Somebody asked me if I was playing not on stream, if I was just playing by myself, what would I have done for my first playthrough? I don't think that my behavior changed that much because I'm streaming this. I mean, obviously, like, I'm stopping to talk about stuff a lot, and I wouldn't be doing that in a normal playthrough. And occasionally I'm, conscious of the fact that I'm on camera, and so I'm thinking about what I'm doing a little bit more carefully than I normally would. But most of the time, this is how I would play a game, and these are the kinds of things that I would be thinking to myself while I play the game. I think my first playthrough would be something very similar to what I did. It would be, especially given that I've played the demo, and so I know kind of what I'm getting into. I know what kind of game this is. I know that I am going to be playing it multiple times, trying different things each time. And so the first time I go through, I mostly want to establish a baseline. I want to see, what is the story if I don't push too hard at any point against what the story is, the story as it's being told. And then I have something to compare all of the rest of my experiences to. On Mostly Walking, I once said that every game is a role-playing game. Huh. Did I? Examined through this lens, doesn't every game have a procedural narrative? Just because some games have a formal narrative intended by the author and some do not, does not mean that the gameplay itself won't always tell a different narrative depending on the player. The player can be viewed as a co-creator. That's a fantastic point, and that's absolutely true. It is also, I would argue, true that exists on a continuum. So that is true to a greater or lesser extent, depending on which game you're playing. Some games allow for very little of that role-playing. I mean, of that sort of player bringing something unique, something new to the story, to the narrative. And it's always present to some degree or another, because you are, to the extent that there is play in the game, right? As we talked about play in Papo.io, we talked about this idea that play is looseness in the system. Play is your ability to act without real consequence, to sort of do things that aren't prescripted, to play soccer with Monster, even though that's not like really a thing that you have to do in the game. To the extent that you have that kind of ability to play, you can role play. You are bringing your own story to the game. You are, in the sense that I like to differentiate the plot of a game with the narrative. And the plot of a game is the things that happen in the sequence that they happen. It is an abstract concept. The narrative of the game is the way that the plot is related to the player, is told to you. So this is true in a movie, right? This is true in any kind of medium. In a movie like, for example, Memento, there is a plot of things that happen sequentially in the world of that movie. And then the narrative of the movie happens in a completely disordered way. And part of it happens backwards, and part of it happens forwards, interleaved with the parts that are happening backwards. And it all depicts the plot. It all depicts the sequence of events that happen in a particular order. But the way that it is presented to you, the narrative of it, is completely different from just the straightforward plot. And that applies enormously to games, because the narrative of a game is what the player does. And that can be very different than the plot of the game. And it will always include the plot of the game to the extent that the game has a plot. If the game has like an authored set of content, this is going to happen, then this is going to happen. That will be part of the narrative. But also part of the narrative is, the part where the player died, trying to jump across this platforming level and fell into the water and was transported back to safety to try again, or the part where the player just sort of stood around for a while because I was taking a phone call. That's sort of theoretically part of the narrative of the game. That's how the events of the game are portrayed through the game. I forgot the original question. I got so distracted by this idea of narrative versus plot. Yeah. So I'm gonna stop it there. I'm gonna say that this is. Oh, we were talking about role playing. Yeah. So this is something that's present in all games, and the degree to which your player narrative can be different than the game's plot sort of represents the amount of latitude that you have to bring your own role playing experience into the game, and that's going to be different from game to game. A rail shooter gives you very little leeway, at least spatially. I mean, like, you're locked into, so comparatively, you're locked into a particular path at a particular speed. You have a limited number of options that you can take. You can role play that to the extent that you make choices about what you're going to shoot, where you're going to shoot, when you're going to shoot. But that's a much more limited degree of role play than in a game like Skyrim or Fallout that is about giving you the freedom to make lots of choices. So, yes, every game is a role-playing game, but to a different extent. And when you're designing a game, it's important to think about how much of that kind of lateral freedom do you want to give the player, and why. So a game like Skyrim creates this sense of the world is enormous, and it's this great big adventure, and you can go out and do anything. And in order to do that, it gives you lots of these kinds of choices, and that's very appropriate in that game. But in I don't know. I'm thinking about like Rage on the iPad, which was a rail shooter. That was trying to accomplish something different, and I don't think did it as successfully as Skyrim. But it's doing it. It's using different tools to create a different player experience because it has a different player experience in mind. Narrative versus plot is like the difference between code presented to a programmer and what the compiler gets after the preprocessor directives. Gosh, that's an interesting metaphor. That's a super interesting metaphor. I don't know that I agree with that as what I was trying to communicate. Just because, but I think that's a super interesting thing to think about, because that's this idea that there's a level of, if I'm drawing this metaphor out correctly, then there's a level of interactivity that is sort of parsable, that's viewable to the player. Like, as a player, I can look at the game and I can understand the systems at a level where I understand a certain degree of interactivity that there is. And then the preprocessor would take that code, in the code metaphor, and streamline it, and also change it, and sort of put in sort of variables where they belong and cut out parts of the code where they don't belong. The part that I'm tripping up on is the preprocessor is actually a process, right? It takes the original, the human readable, the full sort of complete and ambiguous code, and it puts it through a process that turns it into something else that's related, that's machine readable, that is in some ways that's less ambiguous but also less complete. And so if you're saying that the act of, okay, this is fascinating. So the act of playing the game is the same as the preprocessor. Sorry, everybody who like doesn't code and has no idea what I'm talking about. I apologize for this. The idea is you write code as a programmer, and then the machine takes that and figures out the stuff that doesn't need to be there, and figures out stuff that you haven't specified, and turns it into something that the computer can actually run. I think that we are relating this to the possibility space represented by a game. So an unplayed game has this enormous, ambiguous, undefined possibility space. Before the game has been played, there are a bunch of different things that could happen, but not. I mean, I don't know. Maybe potentially an infinite number of things, but not an infinite space of things. There's only there are constraints on the things that could possibly happen within a game. And then a player comes along, like the preprocessor, and actually plays the game and takes all of those ambiguities of choices that you could make, strategies that you could employ, and mistakes that you could make, and actually defines them all. By playing the game, you're collapsing that possibility space down into a single actual playthrough of the game. Similar to the processed code that is outputted by a preprocessor. That was I don't know. I don't know if that was interesting to anybody else, but I found that extremely interesting. That's just an interesting way of thinking about how playing a game collapses that possibility space, which I think is actually a super interesting concept. And the relationship between the game and the possibility space that it represents is super important. And thinking about that, I mean, that is very related to everything that I'm talking about in terms of like the amount of latitude that you have as a player to roleplay within the game. Everybody is learning to code, or is a comp sci student, or at least speaks English. I appreciate that. I'm glad that at least we have that in common. I think that's a good place for us to start. Any other questions? If play is the part of the game that happens without consequence, does that separate the play from the mechanics of actually succeeding or failing at the game? Yeah, so as soon as I said that, I thought that somebody might call me out on that. So I'm claiming that play is a thing that happens without consequence on the sort of what we would understand to be the thrust of the game, the main point of the game. I don't know that that's actually true, because if that's true, then what do you call actually making progress through the game? I could salvage this. I could. So I think that this is it continues to exist on a continuum, right? That if you are talking about, so our extreme examples are going to be very abstract. I don't think that you could make a game. Well, maybe you could. We just wouldn't recognize it as a game necessarily. That had no play in it. That had no ability to do anything that was sort of outside of the bounds of progress in the game. And I think that this means the game that I'm imagining, the experience that I'm imagining, is now extremely linear. I don't know if that's true, if that actually fits my definition, because if you can present the player with a choice where both choices, where both options will progress the game equally, then yeah, okay. So so if you present the player, sorry, I'm thinking this through as I go. Let me start at the beginning. I think that play exists on a continuum, where on one end, abstractly, you can have a game with no play in it. And this is basically a movie, or like a roller coaster or a dark ride. Or actually even less than that, because in a dark ride you have like lots of choices about where you're looking. This is basically like a movie. This is our collapsed possibility space. There is no possibility. Because as soon as you start to introduce possibility, as soon as you introduce decisions, I think you are introducing play at some level. So even if the Stanley Parable is an excellent, I mean, this is what the Stanley Parable is illuminating, or one of the many things. As soon as you create, like, here I've walked through a corridor and now I have two doors, there's two things that you can do. You can either have both of those doors lead to the same place, in which case now you've presented me with a choice that is outside of the sort of constraints of directly progressing the game, right? The choice that I make of going left or right is like, that's not necessary. That's a thing that I can do that isn't meaningful, doesn't have meaningful consequences. Or you can say that there are meaningful consequences through each door, but they have the same value. And I think that you can't do that. I think that as soon as they are not the same consequences, they have to have different values. The only exception to this is the really bad design of, you present the player with two doors that have two values, that have two different things on the other side of them, and you don't tell the player which door is which. You just give them this sort of empty, meaningless choice where, yes, now I am expressing agency, I am making a choice to go left or right, but I don't know what left and right mean, so it doesn't actually matter to me which choice I make, and so this is not a meaningful choice. That, I think, is the opposite of play. I can't really back that up. This would be like, I should do some research on this and like write out a thesis or something. I feel like this mostly fits together. And it mostly fits together on this idea that there's a continuum and there is no such game as one that doesn't have play in it. And so every game is going to have play to some extent, and the more play it has, the more freedom you feel as a player. And at some point, you feel like there is so much freedom that you can do things that don't progress the game at all. But really, any amount of play is some amount of flexibility in the system where you're making choices that either have significance, or you're making choices that don't have game significance but have character significance. Jesus, does that? I don't know if any of that made any sense. I hope you guys are still awake after that. Like, that didn't just put everybody to sleep. One more question, if there is another question. Do you feel the Stanley Parable requires too much background of existing games and their tropes for the majority of players, or at least lessens a lot of its impact? You said yourself that the game, or at least that ending, is for game designers. Yeah, I absolutely believe that this is a game that is designed for game designers. And I think that there is stuff in it that is accessible to a wider audience, but there is very little in this game that is accessible to a game illiterate audience. You have to have played a number of games in order to appreciate the commentary that this game is making, because otherwise the commentary is just sort of nonsensical. It is reflective of games, and especially games of a particular type or style or genre. And it uses the tropes of those games, like first person and the kinds of like controls that you have and the way that you can interact with the world. It uses all of those tropes in a very sort of conscious way that is part of its commentary on games. I think if you brought in somebody who didn't play games at all and put them in front of this game, it would mean very little to them. Unless they were, a particularly thoughtful kind of person who thought about games even though they didn't play them. And those people exist, but I think that's uncommon. I think mostly the people who spend a lot of time thinking about games and developing sort of ideas about what games mean and how they work are the people who either make games or play a lot of games. So I think that that's absolutely the audience for this, and I don't think it has any. It presents any illusions about that. You guys, I'm gonna sleep on this whole idea of play because I'm pretty sure that I said some things, and some of those things actually had significance and like made sense, and some of those things probably didn't make any sense. So the clarifying question. So play is making choices that you find meaningful, whether or not it actually makes a difference. That's fantastic. I don't think I said that. I like that better than anything that I said. I'm going to think about this. In the next Q&A, I think we should talk more about play, especially because the Stanley Parable is so much about these ideas of agency and constraint and exploring sort of the ideas of how much play you have in a game. I think we should come back to this. I'm going to think some more about it. I want you guys to come up with some really, insightful thoughts and questions, and just really deflate that whole theory of what play is and how it relates to game linearity. Just like poke holes in it. Because I think there's something interesting there, but I think I've made it out to be a more complete theory than it really is. I know I said one more, but if there's one more. By this definition, is there play in Tempest, Space Invaders, Asteroids? Shoot the thing, get the points. It's a good question. I mean, there's not much that you can do. I mean, so the answer is yeah, obviously, absolutely, there's play. I mean, I don't know if under the definition that I'm attempting to construct, I'm defining that as play, but if that's the case, then my definition is wrong. Like, descriptively, there is play in Asteroids, whether or not that is what I have been describing. In Asteroids, the play comes from the fact that you can. I mean, I think actually, in a lot of ways, the play comes from the fact that you can succeed or fail, right? I mean, that's what playing the game is. It's making decisions and implementing decisions moment to moment in order to achieve some kind of an outcome. That outcome either being failure in the short term, or survival in the short term, even though sort of failure is guaranteed eventually. And so I think that kind of there is play because the outcome is uncertain. You might actually fail, and that failure then is the outcome of the game, right? That becomes meaningful because the game is over. Okay, I'm gonna stop there. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. Thank you for calling me on this crazy nonsense that I sometimes speak. I think this is especially the influence of the Stanley Parable. The Stanley Parable, goddamn Davy, by design is it is self-consciously pretentious, and so it has gotten me thinking pretentiously, by which I mean thinking a lot, talking a lot before I really think through what I'm saying. Which is actually, I mean, that's fascinating. That's a fascinating outcome for this game to be able to produce, and I'm gonna claim that the game is at least contributing to that, and that's not just me always talking on my ass all the time. Regardless, thank you guys for sticking around. This was a lot of fun. I am planning to be back tomorrow at 9 o'clock to play through a couple more. We'll do the Broom Closet, and we'll do some other fun stuff and see what there is. And then possibly do a Q&A depending on how long we go. So thanks a ton. I love doing this, and it's fun to talk with you all. And technically, I have completed my second 4 in February game, although we'll play some more of it. But I'm feeling good. I'm feeling on track. I'm a little nervous that Half-Life is gonna take forever, but that'll be fun too. All right, have a good night, everybody. Bye.